type of lecture. We look forward to seeing you throughout the coming year. We have another one scheduled for February dealing with weaving, and we have another one for March. This is dealing with the author of the Glass House. We still have refreshments at the end of our time, so we can still talk. If you want to ask questions, we have refreshments in the back. Again, for anybody that came in later, our restroom is to the back and to the right. And there's a little sign if you have to wash your hands first before you flush, because we have old pipes. If you are also interested in becoming a member of the Historical Society, we do have a membership table near the entrance, and please pick up some literature, and it's a unique experience. Our speaker this evening is Brian Brashear, and his presentation is entitled 1759, Colonel James Byrd and the Road to Redstone. Brian is a native of Brownsville and has graduated from the Brownsville area high school. He's always been interested in local history and military history, and has written many articles on topics including early pioneer Jacob Bowman, Washington's Continental Army and the winters of Valley Forge and Morristown, General Henry Heath and the opening day of Gettysburg, and then the histories of the bridges and river crossings across Monongahela here in Brownsville. Some of these articles have even been featured in publications including Pennsylvania Bridges magazine. He's been a featured speaker in organizations such as the Nemacolin Historical Society, the Greene County History Museum, and the General St. Clair chapter of the Sons of the American Revolution, just to name a few. He has done living history presentations at Fort Necessity National Battlefield, Gettysburg National Military Park, and the Senator John Heinz History Center in Pittsburgh. Ladies and gentlemen, Brian Brashear.
Thank you, everyone. Can everyone hear me, by the way? Am I speaking loud enough? A little bit louder? Okay. I'll try to keep my voice up as much as I can. Thank you, Jolene, for the introduction, and thank you, everyone, for coming to visit us here at the Castle for our Days Gone By Winter Lecture Series. My topic tonight is 1759, Colonel James Byrd and the Road to Redstone. I believe that this is an interesting topic and an important topic because here in Brownsville we have a lot of history that surrounds us. Some of it can still be seen, like the castle that we're in right now. A lot of it is not here anymore, much like the fort that we're going to talk about here in a little while. When I was a kid, I was going to preschool, and I asked my mom what preschool I was going to go to, and she told me it was called Fort Byrd. So you can imagine the look on my face, kind of like disappointment when I jumped out of the car the first day of school when I saw I was not going to be attending school in an old frontier fort I thought I was going to be going to. But I did get a good education there, by the way, for a preschool education. But I do believe that this is an interesting topic. I've been reading a lot about it ever since I was a kid, and hopefully I can combine a lot of my readings to the point where everyone can understand tonight the importance of the road, the fort, and the people that built it. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to kind of dim the lights here a little bit, just so we can see the presentation a little bit better. The oil lamps had a pretty good atmosphere, and everyone thinks really good. You can't get a better setting for a historical lecture than this. This is pretty much as good as it gets. So, Colonel James Byrd and the Road to Redstone. As I begin the topic, before I get to Byrd, there are two very important factors that I have to mention in order to set the stage for what Colonel Byrd and his troops are going to do. The first being is I have to let you guys know what the area that we call Redstone, which is where Brownsville is today, was like in the middle of the 1700s. So it's basically a rugged frontier wilderness known as Redstone Old Fort. It got that name from the earliest of settlers who said that they believed that it resembled the old frontier fortifications found in medieval Europe. The name Redstone is translated from the Delaware Indian word, which means stream of the red stones. So if you've ever gone to Redstone High School or junior high, or if you live in Redstone Township or watched a game at Redstone Field, now you know where the word Redstone comes from and where it's translated. So in far earlier centuries, the coal that was there was embedded in the banks, and the bed of the stream had caught fire at some point, giving it a reddish glow, hence the name Redstone. So the countryside was basically a rugged wilderness covered with trees. There were sugar trees, there was chestnut, walnut, ash, oak, hickory, you name it. The land was abundant with wildlife, including deer, bear, wild turkey, rabbits, as well as many other animals. The Monongahela and its tributaries ran pure, making it not only a good source of fresh water, but also very plentiful for fish. So as mentioned, the earliest inhabitants of the area were the Monongahela and Erie Indians, are mentioned as mound builders. We believe that these natives were here as the ancestors to what would eventually become the Iroquois Nation. So for the most part, this area of western Pennsylvania at that time was a vast hunting ground for the natives of the region. And pretty much all of the tribes were under the domination of the Iroquois Nation. There was some Mingo, there was some Delaware, there was some Shawnee here in the area. Most of them had been pushed west by colonists and settlers who were settling in areas like eastern Pennsylvania and Maryland, and kind of pushing the Indians farther west as they moved. One Delaware named Nemacolin had made his home near the mouth of present-day Dunlap Creek, which is right over the hill there. Nemacolin, although he was a Delaware, didn't really seem to associate much with any tribe in particular, including his own. He lived here with his family, and he knew the area very well, perhaps better than anyone else in the 1740s or 1750s. His vast knowledge of the paths and the trails led a lot of white settlers to where they needed to go as they were traveling across the region. So around this time, the colony of Virginia established what was called the Ohio Company. And the Ohio Company was going to press into the area and establish trade here. So commerce, colonization, and trade were the goals of the Ohio Company. One of the first white settlers to come here was Christopher Gist. If you've ever been to Laurel Mall near Connellsville, that is where Christopher Gist's plantation once stood. So Gist comes here and he actually meets Nemacolin, and eventually the Ohio Company employs a man named Thomas Cressup from Maryland to help build the roads here into the Ohio country. And Nemacolin assisted both Cressup and Gist in accomplishing this by introducing them to the paths, trails, to be able to get to where it was that they needed to go. The two most notable trails, one led to the mouth of Redstone Creek called Nemacolin's Path. The other one led to the forks of the Ohio, was called the Nemacolin Trail. So, that is the area of Redstone, something probably of what it would have looked like around 1750, a heavily wooded, forested area. But at this time, what's going on here in the area of the Ohio country once we get to the mid-1750s? Well, there's a conflict that's about to be ignited. Two vast European empires bordered the Ohio country, which is the area that we were standing in right now. The French to the west and the north, and the British to the east and the south. The French saw these traders of the Ohio Company as intruders. They believed they were encroaching on the territory of King Louis. So they sent expeditions into western Pennsylvania, claiming the land for the king and burying lead plates in a chain of forts along the way, southward all the way to the forts of the Ohio. The first shots of the conflict, of course, if you've studied the French and Indian War, were fired by a young Virginian named George Washington at a place called Jumonville Glen, and later on another battle was fought at a place called Fort Necessity. It was just before this happened that a British officer named Captain William Trent built a storehouse at the mouth of Redstone Creek. If you're not familiar with where that is, if you've ever gone down through Albany Tunnel, right down along the riverside here, Redstone Creek, comes out right in front of the tunnel. So the storehouse was right there in that general area. So in 1755, a general comes here named Edward Braddock, and he's going to lead an expedition against Fort Duquesne at the forks of the Ohio. On his way, though, he was ambushed by a party of French and Indian warriors just south of the forts near present-day Braddock, Pennsylvania, and he was soundly defeated. He did, however, accomplish the task of widening a road, leading most of the way to the forts. In 1758, General John Forbes, a British general, led an expedition across the mountains to attack Fort Duquesne. This time, the British were successful. As the French abandoned and burned Duquesne, Colonel Hugh Mercer constructed a small stockade there, called it Fort Pitt. And after a much larger fort would be constructed there by Captain Henry Gordon, and would be under the command of General John Stanwix. Now, the fort would be named Fort Pitt in honor of William Pitt, and eventually the area around it would be known as Pittsburgh, or Pittsburgh as we know it today. Prior to the construction of the fort, in 1759, Captain Henry Gordon accompanied a man named Joseph Shippen on a reconnaissance of the Monongahela region to the south in the area of Redstone Creek. He called this towering position Rich Hill and blazed a large oak tree at its top. We are now seated on Rich Hill. This is the hill that he was referring to. As we go on, Gordon notes that it was one of several prime locations to build a possible fortification in the coming months. Gordon writes to General Stanwix, the road to Redstone Creek turns off at the Great Rock, 5 miles west of the Great Meadows, but the Indian path to the rock is to be kept, and that comes upon the Monongahela, 2 miles above the creek. So, they're already looking at this area as a good position from which to construct a fortification. So in the late summer of 1759, the British are going to deal the decisive blow to the French in hopes of ending the war. They're going to cripple the French at Quebec as General Wolfe defeats the French on the plains of Abraham. So now the majority of the Ohio country, especially that south of the Forks, is firm in British control. But a new alternate route to the Forks is going to be needed for the British to be able to get there. Braddock's road that he had cut was not being used as much, and Forbes' road was under constant threat of Indian attacks. Also, it was now imperative that a road was needed which would be able to provide a water route to Fort Pitt. It was decided that the road to Redstone Creek, which was the original intention of George Washington when he was fought at Battle of Fort Necessity in 1754, was now to be completed, and a fortification was to be built near the junction of the creek and the Monongahela to secure a water route northward to Fort Pitt if need be. So if you look here, we can see this is Forbes Road going to the Forks of the Ohio that he built in 1758. Braddock's Road from an earlier point in 1755 is right here. So what the British want is a road from Gist's Plantation, which is right here, to the river, so they are able to go up the river by water to Fort Pitt if for any reason these roads could not be used. So, in Carlisle, PA, the commander is Colonel Henry Bouquet, and he commands the Royal Americans, the Pennsylvania Provincial Regiment. And Bouquet was a native of a wealthy Swiss family, and he became a traveler in his earlier years. He served in the armies of Sardinia as well as the Netherlands prior to joining the King of England's forces in 1754. He had previously commanded the 16th Regiment of Foot and had fought in battles at Fort Ligonier as well as the Forbes expedition just a year before. So now he's going to instruct Colonel James Byrd to construct the road and the fortification that would be needed to get to the frontier outpost at Fort Pitt, the road to Redstone Creek. So this is the gentleman that Bouquet chooses for the job. This is Colonel James Byrd. So James Byrd was born in Ormisted, Scotland, near Edinburgh, on March 10th, 1726, to a very prominent family. He was one of the oldest in a family of 11 children, and his mother was related to the Lord Provost of Edinburgh, so he did come from distinct nobility. Byrd did receive a good education. There is no evidence that he received a military education, but it is quite likely and almost certain, as you will see later on in the presentation with his accomplishments. He had 2 older brothers who fell in battle in the King's Army in previous years. Byrd eventually moves to London, where he determines that it's going to be his goal to set out across the Atlantic. He's going to be a businessman. He wants to go into business here in the new colonies. So he contacts business associates of his father who are in Jamaica, and he heads to that island before heading north to Philadelphia. He arrives there in the spring of 1748. So here he rents a small storeroom and he becomes a merchant. And he has very good business sense. His business takes off really well at the beginning. He marries a lady named Sarah Shippen. She is the daughter of Edward Shippen. Now the Shippens are a very prominent family in the colony of Pennsylvania at this point. Who here has heard of Shippensburg, Pennsylvania? Well, of course, that's named for the Shippen family. They owned a vast majority of the land there, and that is why it's called Shippensburg today. But eventually, Byrd's mercantile business gives way to more important duties to managing his father-in-law's estates, businesses, and land holdings. He began to involve himself with a coming conflict that was brewing in the Ohio country. He knew that war was going to be imminent with the French. So he assists in building a supply road for Braddock in the campaign of 1755. So that right there tells us he had already had some kind of previous military experience to be able to jump right into be able to doing that. And following Braddock's defeat, he suggests building a fort at Raystown to prevent Indian raids into the Cumberland Valley. but he is denied by a man named John Dunbar, who was also a British officer. Dr. John Donahue states that Braddock's defeat and Dunbar's retreat were two of the greatest disasters in the history of Pennsylvania, but both could have been avoided with a man such as James Byrd in command, as he was thoroughly familiar with the situation and could have successfully met with it. So again, another reminder that Byrd most likely knew what he was doing as far as being a military officer. His reputation as a quality soldier was becoming well known on the frontier by 1756. He built Fort Morris in Shippensburg, Pennsylvania, and contributed to the construction of Fort Ligonier. Byrd takes command of a place called Fort Augusta along the Susquehanna River and was promoted to colonel on December 8, 1756. He did take part in the battles of the Forbes expedition to take Fort Duquesne, and shortly thereafter he helped repair roads and fortifications in the area near Erie. In the summer of 1759, Byrd and his 3rd Battalion of the Pennsylvania Regiment were now commissioned by Colonel Bouquet to their most important task to date: completing the road to Redstone and constructing a fort and a storehouse there. He chose 2 important people to accompany his 200-man expedition. The first was his brother-in-law, Captain Joseph Shippen, who had already been here with Captain Gordon just the year before, so he knew the ground pretty well. And also he picked a man named Thomas Cressup as his guide. And as I mentioned earlier, Thomas Cressup did know Nemacolin, and I'm sure Nemacolin told him the ins and outs of the pass and the trails to be able to navigate here through the Ohio country. So, Byrd departs from Carlisle, and his first stop is here. This is Fort Cumberland in present-day Maryland in August of 1759. Now, a good thing about James Byrd is he liked to write things down. He kept a meticulous journal, and he also wrote a lot of letters to his family, to his superior officers, to anyone that he could. So that gives us a really good record of Byrd's campaign and what he knew or didn't know as he went along. As he was stationed at Fort Augusta and as he went to Fort Cumberland, there are a lot of records to show just exactly how his campaign was going. He found supplies hard to come by for his expedition. A lot of the colonial citizens in the area of Fort Cumberland were wary of giving supplies to colonial troops. Reason being is when Braddock passed through here 4 years earlier, he had promised all of these citizens that they were going to be paid for the livestock that they gave, for the grain that they gave to the army. But what happened? Braddock got soundly defeated, and a lot of these people never received their payment. So all of a sudden, here comes another colonial army coming through asking for the same things. So you can see where they're a little bit hesitant to be able to give up some of their things to another campaign that could possibly end the same way as Braddock's did. So they were on the fence about giving up supplies right from the very beginning. As Byrd is going to start this campaign, he's going to see that it's not going to be a cakewalk. He's going to have a lot of problems go his way before he actually makes it to Redstone. So he does eventually get enough supplies to be able to begin the expedition. He's going to depart from right here in Fort Cumberland. So in early September of 1759, he departs Fort Cumberland. He's going to begin his trek northward. He's going to begin along the road that Braddock had built in 1755. But almost immediately after departing, Byrd falls severely ill with a terrible fever, and he's going to be out for 4 days before the expedition can really even get moving. He does recover rather quickly by using what was called Jesuit's bark. They made a tea out of it, and apparently it did a really good job for Colonel Byrd because he did get back in the saddle and was able to move his troops farther to the west in just a few days. But the next 3 days after he recovered, it still gets worse. There was a heavy downpour of rain for 3 straight days. So what happened now is the road cut by Braddock the year before was now inundated and flooded with mud, water, and debris. Wagons got stuck. Some of the officers had to give up their horses to carry supplies, and they didn't like that very much. They didn't come on this expedition to walk on foot like the common soldier. They wanted to be able to ride like the officers that they were. As they continued, the weather did begin to dry out, but it slowed them down just a little bit. However, the conditions of the road did not improve, and not just because of the weather. 4 years of weathering and little travel had given nature a chance to take back parts of Braddock's road. Byrd noted in his journal that nearly all of the bridges were now in disrepair, and much of the road was overgrown. Rocks were protruding through the road, and much of the road had been cut almost directly uphill without turns. So it's apparent that when Braddock had this road cut, he did it in haste and did not take the time to make all the necessary improvements to be able to make it last as long as he thought it would need to last. Byrd sends word back to Carlisle immediately that he intends to push on, but he needs Bouquet to send more men, that they're going to be needed to be able to send from Fort Cumberland to improve the conditions of this road, namely removing all of the rocks and repairing all the bridges. So Byrd's probably about a week into this campaign. He can't find supplies. He fell ill with a terrible fever. It rained the first 3 days. The road is in really bad shape, and even when it dried out, he still has to make improvements to it. It's not off to a very good start for Colonel Byrd and the Royal Americans. So bad weather, low supplies, and excess labor. Remember, this affects the morale of the troops. It's hard to have troops doing their job properly if they're not properly motivated to do it. And if there's not enough food to give them, or if they're out working excess hours to repair something that should have been repaired years ago, they're going to have a problem doing that. So on September 5th, 17 of Byrd's best troops desert the battalion, as he writes in his journal. He then writes to Bouquet of the incident of the desertion and requests that patrols be sent out immediately to locate them. Unfortunately, I don't have any information as to whether those troops were located or whether they had just simply escaped and went back home. So 5 days later, the troops arrive at the area known as Great Meadows. If you've ever been to Fort Necessity, you know that that's another name for the place where Washington had battled the French 5 years earlier in 1754. So here, Byrd's men set up camp and they allow the animals to graze and drink. The next morning, they're going to set back out over the mountains, Laurel Hill, and they're going to pass the location of Braddock's grave, which is the location that we know it to be today. Around midday, they come to another location. It's Dunbar's supply camp, where he kept all the supplies during the Braddock expedition. In a rocky, swampy hollow, Byrd noted that this was the worst piece of ground anyone could have ever chosen for an encampment. The camp was strewn with musket balls, cannonballs, supply crates, all that had been left over from the Braddock expedition. It was apparent that Dunbar's men had hurriedly just abandoned these supplies and munition following Braddock's defeat, and as they returned east. His men searched for the cannon, but concluded that the French must have found them and carried them off. At sunset, the troops reached Gist Plantation, near where Laurel Mall stands today, where they camped there for a period of 2 days. During their stay, horses and cattle grazed in the grasslands, but soldier supplies were really beginning to dwindle now. During their stay, hunting parties were sent out to procure some food to be able to replace those supplies. At this time, both Byrd and Shippen, along with a lieutenant named Graydon, set out to search for Redstone Creek. Remember, this was the first time Byrd had been here. He didn't exactly know where it was. So on their journey, they located the old blazes, which were placed by Washington on his attempt to build the road to Redstone 4 years earlier. He would use these blazes as his guide, and at noon on September 13th, he and his men begin their mission to connect Braddock's road to the mouth of Redstone Creek. Now they're able to fulfill the mission that Bouquet had set them out to do. Byrd immediately blazed 2 trees from this point. One read, "The Road to Redstone, J. Byrd, 1759. The other one, he wrote Braddock's Road, simply the road to Pittsburgh, 1759. So one road is going to come here to Brownsville and Redstone Creek. Another road is going to go north to the forks of the Ohio, where Pittsburgh now stands. So work progresses rather quickly, and just over a week later, the men are only 4 miles from Redstone. So it got off to a rough start when they left Cumberland. Now it's all starting to come together, and Byrd is starting to be able to rest at ease just a little bit, but he still does have a supply problem. He rides ahead to the river and scouts the area around the mouth of the creek, by where Albany Tunnel now stands. He notices that the area there, where the creek and river intersect, would be a poor location for a fortification, as it was surrounded by high ground on 3 sides, much as it is today. If you go there today, you'll still be able to see that. However, the site marked the previous year by Captain Gordon on Rich Hill, which is where we now sit, was the perfect place for a fort, and Byrd realized it immediately. Later that evening, he rode back to rejoin his command, and he was delighted to see that the road had already advanced 2 miles that day, thanks to some good weather and workable ground. That evening, they camped about 2 miles from Redstone at a place called Coal Run. Byrd noted that it had some of the finest coal he had ever seen, and he went so far as to burn a full bushel of it on his fire that evening. So James Byrd could have very well been the first European here in the area to realize just how good the coal was here in the area of western Pennsylvania. We look back today and we see that coal has become a staple for many people's jobs here. James Byrd realized that in 1759, so he may have been one of the first to be able to do that. So soon after, the region would become well known for its rich coal deposits. He wrote to Colonel Bouquet that he had found the location for his fortification and that it commanded both the creek and the river and was commanded by absolutely nothing. The next day, September 23rd, was a Sunday. The morning began with a sermon from the battalion chaplain, Dr. Allison. Around midday, the construction of the road was resumed, and by nightfall, the last 2 miles had been completed. The road to Redstone measured 16 miles from its starting point near Gist Plantation to the area that we now stand close to the Monongahela River. So now the construction of the fort on Rich Hill is able to begin. So on Sunday evening, September 23rd, the troops arrive here on Rich Hill and make the camp here at Redstone. From this night on, September 23rd, it's really interesting because you can actually pinpoint the exact night where settlement would begin in an area. September 23rd, 1759, the wilderness of Redstone would be no more. From that point on, there would always be some sort of settlement here at Redstone and eventually Brownsville. So as permanent occupation of the area would commence, there would be more and more settlers coming through here. But the men took this evening to rest and relax. Construction on the fort was scheduled to begin immediately the following morning. So as the sun rose the next morning, the sound of axes could be heard all over the hillside. Trees began to fall, thus creating material to be able to build the fort, as well as a clear view from the top of the hill. Near the edge of the river, a saw pit was constructed as fallen trees were rolled down to be easily cut and shaped. They were then transported back to the point of the hill on horse-drawn skids. Unfortunately, we don't know the exact location where this saw pit was located, but it would be really, really interesting to find that out and see just where they drew the skids up here to Rich Hill. Smaller logs could be used as firewood. The purpose of this fort would be to both assist with supply and transportation to Fort Pitt, as well as a protection refuge for future travelers, traders, and settlers in the area. The design fortification was drafted by Colonel Shippen, Byrd's brother-in-law, who was also an engineer. Shippen recorded that the site chosen was about 50 yards from the river. The fort would be constructed of earth and wood and would be in the shape of the typical British frontier style, in the square shape with 4 pointed bastions, one at each corner. So early work on the fort progressed smoothly. However, by the final days of September, Byrd again has a serious problem. The supply problem is again making itself known. The food was nearly gone. Soldiers had already began to live on just 1 pound of beef and a half a pound of flour per day since their arrival here. On September 30th, Byrd writes a hasty letter to Bouquet. The flour has run out completely, and there are only 3 bullocks left. The men eagerly anticipated resupply from Fort Cumberland, but as to this point, nothing had arrived. So they just completed building this road from Cumberland all the way here to Redstone Creek. They had began construction on this fort. The men had fought through fought through heat. They had fought through rain, disastrous conditions on the road. They're tired, and now their supplies are basically gone. Byrd has a serious problem again. As the men waited their supplies, at one point they were so disheartened that Colonel Byrd ordered his chaplain, a man named Dr. Allison, to deliver an afternoon sermon at 3 p.m. to boost morale and assure the men that assistance would not be far away, because now talks of mutiny and desertion were now beginning to surface in the ranks. Colonel Byrd has to stop this immediately. He can't allow it to go any further. So he does the right thing. He orders his chaplain to call a sermon and say, hey, let's get these troops together. Let's be able to get them right psychologically and be able to get them what they need to be able to make it to when the supplies come. This did give the men a confidence boost, and Byrd orders a temporary halt to all construction here on the fort to allow the men to send out hunting parties in search of deer, turkey, or anything that they can find. They also trekked back and forth to the river and did happen to catch enough fish to help sustain them. Just a few days later, pack horses carrying supplies were seen on the horizon arriving from Fort Cumberland. So Byrd, through his good leadership, and as well as the sermon of Dr. Allison, was able to keep the men in the good state of mind. On October 8th, Byrd wrote to General Stanwix at Fort Pitt that the supplies had arrived, morale was beginning to improve. The only thing that hadn't happened was the supply hinges that he had ordered for the gate did not arrive. So if that's the only thing that was the downfall of that, I'd say he did pretty good in weathering that storm. A potentially disastrous situation had now been averted. Throughout Byrd's entire military career, including this endeavor, Byrd recorded events in his journal, but he also, as I mentioned, exchanged many letters with his family members, including his wife, Sarah Byrd, who was back in Carlisle. One letter does survive to this day. The letter is from Sarah to James. It reads, "To Colonel James Byrd, Esquire, at Redstone Creek." So mail was going back and forth because she knew that he was here already. On October 26, 1759, the letter was written. And Sarah pens it, "Dear Mr. Byrd." She calls her husband Mr. Byrd. You can see how everyone was proper back in those days. "I just now received 37 pounds and 4 shillings, for which I owe you many thanks." So he was sending a lot of his pay probably back home to Sarah. "Captain Young is to leave a horse of yours with me. He was going to leave him with Johnny Piper, but he said no, he did not have good pasture. Please write to me if you would like him at your location, and I shall endeavor to have him sent to you. If not, I shall find him good pasture here and pledge to take the best of care of him. I should be glad to hear from you as often as I can. I can also give you the glorious news that we share from time to time, especially that of Canada being taken, which I desire and am thankful for." So she has heard word that Quebec has fallen. Now the British have all but basically driven the French out of North America, pending the treaty, which is going to be signed here a few years later. "We are still in the same house, and I am doubtful that the Neves house," that's their neighbor, "will be ready before spring. I do not give up hope of seeing you this fall, but now I must bid you goodbye until our next correspondence, as it is late at night. Please give my love to my brother Joseph, and send my compliments to General Stanwix, Colonel Bouquet, as well as the other gentlemen. I conclude with praying that Almighty God may bless, prosper, and protect you. I am your dutiful and sincerely affectionate wife until death, Sarah Byrd. P.S. All of our family gives their kind love to you, and the children are well and give their duty unto you." So a very nice letter written by Sarah to her husband here at Redstone. So Byrd corresponds with Bouquet and Stanwix also, keeping them updated on the constant progress of the fort as it's being constructed. So at that time, Byrd had been addressing his letters from the camp at the mouth of Nemacolin's Creek. At that time, Dunlap's Creek, which is just over the hill here, was called Nemacolin's Creek because Nemacolin had lived in the area at one time. Bouquet suggests a name change for the fort. He said that's too long. He found it to be too long and too Indian, as he called it. Byrd wrote to Stanwix at Fort Pitt asking for recommendations for a name of the garrison. Stanwix began addressing his letters to Byrd's fort. The fort then took on the name almost automatically, being called Fort Byrd. So if you've ever wondered where the name Fort Byrd comes from, Byrd didn't name the fort after him by himself. General Stanwix actually named it Fort Byrd in honor of Byrd because he didn't know what else to call it. So the fort itself was constructed of earth and wood and is in the shape of the typical British frontier fort. It had the 4-point bastions, and Shippen, who was the engineer here, records the dimensions as follows. The curtain is 97 1/2 feet. The flanks are 16 feet. The faces of the bastions are 30 feet. The ditch between the bastions 24 feet wide with a log house for magazines, women, and children, which is 39 feet square. The gate is to be 6 feet high and 8 feet wide. A trench surrounds the exterior. The palisades were installed to bolster against frontal attacks and battering rams. A well was dug inside the walls as a source of fresh water. Bastions allowed cannon and musket fire to aim from all directions and all corners and angles. The formidable construction and high location helped ensure the fort's defenses during any type of potential siege. Years later, while visiting the fort, Bouquet recalled that it was one of the prettiest things that he had ever seen and was constructed with the utmost nicety. So what do we learn about Colonel Byrd here? He's not just a good soldier, he's also a good builder. He had helped construct all those forts in eastern Pennsylvania. He helped with Fort Ligonier, and he builds Fort Byrd almost perfectly to its specifications. So Colonel Byrd, in addition to being a good soldier, is also a good builder of fortifications as well as roads. But shortly after the construction of the fort was completed, Byrd is not going to stay here. He's going to depart via the river for Fort Pitt. So shortly thereafter, he departs on the river with the majority of his troops that are going to go with him. Only 25 men and 1 officer are going to be left here to garrison the fort on Rich Hill. So he leaves them here, and as he goes by canoe up to Fort Pitt, on the shores at the forks of the Ohio, there are some gentlemen there to meet him. It was considered a proper procedure in the British Army that if another officer was coming to visit your fortification, you were to do the right thing and go out to be able to greet him whenever he arrived. So several officers went out to greet Colonel Byrd at Fort Pitt. One of them was General Stanwix. One of them was Colonel Bouquet and Colonel William Byrd of Virginia. James Byrd wasn't the only Colonel Byrd in the provincial forces here in America. There was another colonel from Virginia. His name was William Byrd, and actually James and William were fighting to be able to build this road. Eventually, James got the go-ahead to be able to do it from Bouquet. Colonel William Byrd actually is going to stay in the British Army, and he's going to remain loyal to the British years later during the American Revolution. But they're all out there to meet him, and another gentleman that's there to meet them is a guy that's going to become even more famous than all of them. His name is Captain Horatio Gates. If you've ever studied the American Revolution, you know that Horatio Gates was a general in the Continental Army. You also know that he fought at the Battle of Saratoga, as well as several battles in the Southern Campaign later on in the years of the war. So a lot of people who would go on to make a name for themselves in the Revolutionary War were there to greet Colonel Byrd when he arrived at Fort Pitt. So all these gentlemen are there, and although Fort Byrd itself was a structural masterpiece and built perfectly in frontier fortification engineering, its main goal was more of that of a chain of command, chain of communication and supply, as opposed to a fort which is going to see a lot of siege action or battle action. So the fort is going to do its job as a communication link rather as a defensive position. It can do that if necessary, but its main goal is to link the road and Fort Pitt. So, as 1759 progresses, the French are being driven out of North America. The thing about Fort Byrd is it's very important to our history here at Brownsville, but it didn't really take place until the end of the French and Indian War. After Quebec, that was basically the death knell for the French here in western Pennsylvania. But as Britain secured control of most of the North American continent, Fort Byrd remained here at Redstone as a reminder of Redstone's importance. It remained garrisoned during the conflict with the Indians, which would come later, known as Pontiac's Rebellion, just a few years later. The proclamation of 1763, which was issued by the king, stated that with the exception of frontier outposts and forts, there was to be no permanent European settlement in the area west of the Allegheny Mountains, including here at Redstone. So the area we're talking about, where we're located, is right here. You can see, what does it say? It says Indian Reserve. They're reserving this territory for the Indians at the conclusion of the French and Indian War. All British colonists are being told to stay here in the pink section along the seacoast and just a little bit further inland. This was all French territory, known as Quebec, that would eventually be ceded to the British. But the British government is telling these settlers here in the colonists, you are not to cross the Allegheny Mountains. The only thing that's to be over there are forts and trading posts. But, much like in the years of the Revolution, we as American colonists didn't take orders from the king very well. Because what's going to happen? All of these people are going to start moving west because there's not a lot of soldiers out here to be able to enforce that law. I kind of liken it to a group of children who are sitting at a kitchen table and their mother tells them, don't you touch that cookie jar, and then she leaves the room. Well, one kid's going to go take a cookie, and then what's going to happen? Another one's going to go, and another one's going to go. So eventually, what's going to happen? The law is just basically going to get ignored, and people are going to be crossing the mountains and settling here. So although the law was in place, very few heeded it. This is the proclamation. Many settlers continued to flow into the Ohio country, and the natives here were very, very upset that this was happening because now their hunting grounds are being encroached upon, and there are squatters coming over here to their lands. So although the settlement was now outlawed, many settlers did remain here at Redstone. In April of 1767, a company of soldiers was actually sent here to hold a meeting at Fort Byrd to inform the settlers that they must immediately vacate the area. As the soldiers returned to Fort Pitt, they set fire to every cabin that they came across and able to solidify their motive. However, even this was not enough to stop the settlement here at Redstone. Michael Cressup, remember that name, Cressup, Thomas Cressup, this is his son Michael, actually came here in 1768 and secured a claim from Virginia for 400 acres in the area around the fort, which would be right here where Brownsville now stands. The colony of Pennsylvania now issued a proclamation declaring that all citizens must immediately vacate the Monongahela Valley under penalty of death. So, they don't want the settlers here at all. This was done in an effort to avoid another Pontiac's rebellion. They didn't want the natives arising to be able to come here and go after the settlers again a second time. But however, what's going to happen is in May of 1768, a council is going to be held at Fort Pitt. The Iroquois protested these settlers here at Redstone, but the matter is soon going to fade away into history as a new treaty was about to be struck, which is going to transfer all of this territory under British control. So the Indians are going to lose all claims to this land eventually. They would no longer have any right to the Ohio country. In 1774, another conflict is going to break out here between the colony of Virginia and the Shawnee. We call it Dunmore's War. Indian attacks have become more frequent here on the frontier at this time, and Fort Byrd, which was still standing right here, was now garrisoned again under the command of Major Angus MacDonald. Nothing says you're a Scotsman more than a name like Angus MacDonald. It doesn't get more Scottish than that. So he is garrisoned here with some soldiers to help protect the settlers here in the area. The following year saw the beginnings of what will become a new nation, as the American Revolution is now going to begin to take shape. Throughout the war, Fort Byrd, although far from the main theater of conflict, remained garrisoned for the cause of the Continental War effort. The fort housed the powder magazines for most of the counties west of the Alleghenies, under the temporary command of Colonel Thomas Brown. How about that name Brown? That's eventually who the town is going to be named after. He actually commanded Fort Byrd here for a short time during the Revolution. So, in August of 1777, the commander at Fort Pitt, a man named Thomas Gaddis, is going to send a message to Colonel Brown here at Fort Byrd, informing him that there are rumors of a loyalist plot to capture or destroy all of the powder magazines that are being kept here at Fort Byrd at Redstone. So extra guards were posted in all of the bastions, and extra watchmen were posted on sentry duty, and more frequent patrols were sent up and down the rivers and creeks just to make sure. Fortunately for the Continentals, no plot ever unfolded, and they didn't really have to worry about it, but they were on heavy guard here when Fort Byrd was being used during the American Revolution. That wasn't all that Fort Byrd held for the American Revolution, though. In May of 1778, this gentleman, George Rogers Clark, is going to lead an expedition deep into the Illinois country, which is the far west, Indiana, Illinois, Kentucky, against the British and their Indian allies there. So he recruits 4 companies of soldiers and concentrates them here at Redstone. Fort Byrd served as their initial base of operations in preparation for the expedition. So this very important expedition that's going to happen against the British to be able to drive them out of the Illinois country is going to start right here where we're now standing. And this is a map of Clark's expedition. You can see where it starts right here at Redstone, and they're going to take the rivers to use their routes west. And they're going to head down the Ohio all the way here into the Illinois country, and a decisive battle is going to be fought here at a place called Vincennes. And Clark's troops are going to defeat the British under a general by the name of Hamilton. And he was called the hair buyer because he liked to purchase scalps of his enemies. So what happened is Clark drives the British out, and all of this is going to fall under Continental control. So Clark, with his expedition, nearly doubles the size of the original Northern American colonies. So a very, very important act of the American Revolution started right here at Redstone. A lot of people don't realize those things, but Fort Byrd in itself held that kind of importance at the time in the 1700s. So Clark and his troops travel these rivers westward, and they drive the British out. And approximately 25 years later, George's younger brother, William Clark, is also going to use the fort here, at Redstone as a launching point for another famous expedition. We know it today as the Lewis and Clark expedition. It also began right here where we're now standing. So the Clark name was definitely well known here at Redstone. In the immediate years following the Revolution, however, the fort was no longer garrisoned, and it began to fall into disrepair. And although its walls were still used as refuge and shelter for settlers heading west to places like Kentucky or Ohio or Illinois, eventually nature is going to begin to take back this important structure, which was built about 30 years earlier by Colonel Byrd, as we had just mentioned. So now the eternal question: where was the fort? Well, this has been the subject of long debate here in Brownsville, and there are two primary locations that always tend to get mentioned. One of them, the most likely, is right here where we're now sitting, the location where Nemacolin Castle now stands. Before we go any farther, we're sitting right here, by the way. This is where we're heading to the castle, if anybody ever wanted to know. The other location is right across Front Street over there, near an area that we call here as the Commons. So, both sides make good arguments for the location of the fort. If you ask me, just by what I have read, if I had to pick one of the two, I'm going to pick right here where the castle stood. The two most probable locations are here and there, but I think this one has more of a claim. Reason being, if the castle, the trading post for the castle was built 1789. So I'll get into that in 1 second here, so that I'll move down a little bit further. What I want you to do, though, is look at the ground here in front, the front yard of the castle, which is right in front of us. Can you see how it's stepped right there? There's like in layers. Well, that's important to note when we're discussing the place where the fort stood, because in the 1940s, the hillside actually extended farther out toward the river. It's much farther out than it was today. Now, we remember that Colonel Shippen said that the fort was approximately 50 yards from the river, correct? If you extend that hillside all the way out, that's about the amount of hill that they would have needed to be able to do that. In the 1940s, they took a lot of this out to be able to take down to the riverbank, to be able to bolster against flooding. So the hillside extended much farther out than it does today. Also, if you've ever visited here at Nemacolin Castle, before you come into the tour, sometimes you may have to wait. If you make an immediate left and go into the gift shop, what's the first thing you see? There's a well right there. Now, when Jacob Bowman came here in 1786 to establish a trading post, that well was already here. And it was believed that that well was the original well from the soldiers' fort. So that makes a good case for that, because if you remember the diagram, there was a well which is in close proximity to the log house. So also what's important about that well is if you look at the diameter, the well and the castle sitting room, which is where the original log cabin where Jacob Bowman first lived, are almost the exact same distance away from each other. So when Jacob Bowman came here, he may have very well built his original log cabin on top of the log house from Fort Byrd. Unfortunately, the people that can answer that question are long gone, and we will never know for sure. We can just do our best to kind of break down where we think it was. But also, most importantly, we have to remember that we've just seen that Colonel Byrd was a very good builder. Now, he didn't rise to the rank of colonel in one of the most powerful militaries of the most powerful empires in the world by not making the right decisions. If you look at the Commons area over here, and you look at the castle area where we're now standing, that ground is a lot lower than the ground that we're now standing on. So that's important for two reasons. Number one, of course, if you're going to build a fort, you don't want to build it right next to a place where your enemy can come and just shoot right down on top of you. That's not a good idea. Also, when it rains, you don't want all of the water to descend on top of you either. So building it on the highest point is the most likely thing to do. And Colonel Byrd definitely would not have made a mistake that would have cost him either A, to lose the fort to siege by building it on lower ground, or B, to have his soldiers living in a swampy condition just by building it over there where the Commons are. Also, like I've noticed on Front Street here, when the water flows, it flows. So if he would have built that fort there, there would have been some soldiers with some wet feet. I can tell you that right off the bat. So if you were to ask me, I think probably the fort was right out here in front of where the castle now stands, probably back a little farther, maybe into where the area of the castle is. Maybe it had even protruded a little bit over the area of the commons, but again, we'll never know for sure. The case for the commons was made in a book by James Beach in 1894, which says that the fort was built on the ground in front of the castle now stands and opposite of the land owned by Nelson Bowman. But it doesn't say opposite in which direction. It can be opposite here, not necessarily opposite over there. So if you were to ask me, I would say that the castle location, which is where we're now sitting, is the most likely place for where the fort once stood. We could very well, where we are right now, could be inside the walls of where the fort was. So, with that said, what happened to some of these people that I had talked about? So Colonel Henry Bouquet, who I mentioned, he continued to remain in the service of the King's troops in the American colonies. During Pontiac's rebellion, he commanded troops at the Battle of Bushy Run near present-day Jeannette, Pennsylvania. In 1764, he was given command of the entire garrison at Fort Pitt. The following year, he was promoted to brigadier general and placed in command of all British forces in the southern colonies. In the summer of 1765, though, he fell ill with yellow fever, and he died at Pensacola, Florida on September 2nd, 1765. Now that's important, because if you study Colonel Bouquet, you can see just how fast he rose through the ranks of the British colonial army. And he did pass away in 1765, which is about 10 years before the Revolution had broke out. But had he lived, it could have very well been Bouquet surrendering to Washington at Yorktown as opposed to Cornwallis. Because you see, not only did he rise to command all the forces in the southern colonies, he eventually probably would have rose to command all British forces in the colonies because he had been here so long. But unfortunately, he passed away in 1765. George Rogers Clark, who launched that brave expedition that helped secure the entire Western Territory for the United States during the American Revolution. His expedition to the Illinois country helped win French alliance in the American Revolution. It was very important. And he continued to defend the area of the Illinois country as well as the Ohio River Valley all the way to the end of the war. At the Treaty of Paris, Britain ceded all of the Illinois country to the United States, thereby doubling the size of the original 13 colonies. Virginia statesman George Mason called Clark the conqueror of the Northwest. After the war, he remained in those western territories, defending settlers and negotiating treaties with local tribes. In 1790, he was awarded 150,000 acres in what is today Clark County in southern Indiana. However, financial problems did begin to plague him, stemming from the fact that all of Clark's expeditions he had funded out of pocket, and he had not been repaid for them. So for a brief period, he went so far as to offer his services to the government of France to be able to pay for them, to be able to pay his debts and run his large estate. But in 1803, he sold his Indiana land holdings and moved south to a cabin in Louisville, Kentucky. And here he used his knowledge of the western frontier to help settlers making their homes there. In 1812, the Virginia General Assembly finally recognized the importance of what Clark had done during the American Revolution, and they awarded him a pension of $400 per year for his service in the Revolution. Clark actually died of a stroke in Louisville in 1818. So again, Clark's entire career, the career that made him, started right here at Redstone. Sarah Bird was James' lifelong wife, companion, and confidant. She and James would go on to have 10 children. Sarah remained a loyal, hardworking, and influential woman and always supported the endeavors of her husband. During the Revolution, her niece, Margaret Peggy Shippen, went on to marry one of the most pivotal personalities of the entire war, General Benedict Arnold. Sarah died on September 17th, 1784. As for her husband, James, following the French and Indian War, James Bird returned to Fort Augusta, and he remained with the Royal Pennsylvania Regiment until it dissolved in 1760. He returned to his home and was named Justice of Lancaster County in 1764 and held that position all the way to 1770. But now, as the Revolution approached on the horizon, Bird gained much support for the Continental Congress in his area in opposition to the British Crown, which he had once served. He was appointed to serve on the Continental Committee of Safety in December of 1776, but he soon resigned to issues regarding rank and insubordination. Bird died at his home Tinnen in Dauphin County, Pennsylvania on October 5th, 1793. He is buried alongside his wife Sarah at the Old Presbyterian Cemetery in Middletown, PA. So you can imagine the Byrd and the Shippen family. Here is Sarah, his wife. Most of the family are well-to-do British colonial citizens. They don't want to break away from the king or from the British government. And here you have James, her husband, who is walking around gaining support for the colonial or for the continental government. Can you imagine what that was like at family gatherings? And then you have her niece, who goes on to marry Benedict Arnold, an American general, who eventually sells the plains of West Point to the British in coercion with Major John Andre. So a lot going on there through the Byrd and the Shippen families. And if you look here, this is the marker outside of where Colonel James Byrd, his home is in Dauphin County, Pennsylvania. You can see it really doesn't mention anything about his road here to Redstone, but this was basically a minor event in Byrd's career compared to everything else that he had done. But of course, here to us at Redstone, it's very, very important. And this is outside of the cemetery. It shows where James and Sarah are going to be interred, right inside the entrance of the cemetery there. They are very, very famous people there all the way to this day in the area of Shippensburg. There's a James Byrd Elementary School. And of course, the town of Shippensburg, as I meant, is named after the entire Shippen family. So they still, to this day, are being recognized out there. And this, of course, is the tombstone. James and Sarah are buried together here in Dauphin County, Pennsylvania, in the eastern part of the state. So the 1759 campaign by James Byrd played a crucial role not only in the eventual settlement of the area here at Redstone and the location of the town of Brownsville, but also went on to become a precursor for more important events in American history. As mentioned, the George Rogers Clark expedition to the Illinois country, as well as the 1803 Lewis and Clark expedition to explore the Louisiana Purchase, all the way to the Pacific Ocean. The road to Redstone would lead many settlers to new homes in the West, as we see here. The fort constructed here would serve entirely as an early gateway to a nation which was just about to be born. Without James Byrd, his road, and his fortification here at Redstone, the town of Brownsville may not have sprung up here. It may have sprung up in another location, if even at all. There would be no Nemacolin Castle. There would be no cast iron bridge. There would be no other rich history here in Brownsville that we have grown to appreciate so much all the way to this day. And that Brownsville would eventually become widely known for. The 1759 campaign by Byrd and his troops was the initial decisive act which would establish Brownsville, as well as prominent businessmen such as Jacob Bowman, statesmen such as Philander Knox and John Littleton Dawson, and even riverboat pioneers that would come here, such as Captain Henry Shreve, who piloted the first riverboat from Pittsburgh all the way south to New Orleans, Louisiana, and back. He was the first to do it, and he lived right here in Brownsville, right on Front Street, about 2 blocks up from where we're now sitting. All of these men contributed greatly to the overall growth of the United States, and none of them would have ever made their way here or even made their mark on history had it not been for Colonel Byrd and his remarkable accomplishment in 1759. Remember all of the hardships that he and his troops had to overcome. They could have easily just turned back and said, we can't pass because of the rain, or Colonel Byrd could have said, I'm too sick to carry on, someone else take command of the troops. They may not have made it all the way here to Redstone. So, it was instrumental in also bonding both the Monongahela region as well as Pittsburgh and the forks of the Ohio to the eventual claim to the state of Pennsylvania during territorial disputes with Virginia, because Pennsylvania troops had built this road here to Redstone, not Virginia troops. So as we have seen, this campaign was not an easy task. Low supplies, declining morale, and the constant threat of Indian attacks in an unfamiliar wilderness were serious causes of concern for Byrd and all of these troops. And however, he and his officers and his battalion were able to persevere through all of it. They persevered through these obstacles and were able to achieve the higher goal of their objective of creating the road here to Redstone. I believe under the command of any lesser of a man than Colonel Byrd, this road would not have been built, and also there probably would not have been a fortification built here at Redstone. Many of them would have turned back or went into a full panic whenever they found out there were no supplies. But Byrd held his battalion together and was able to get the fort built. Though at the time, Byrd's construction of the road, as well as the fort, may have seemed minor in comparison with other events such as the fall of Quebec and the Treaty of Paris, its legacy continues to shine through its importance of what would become on the horizon, and namely that is Brownsville. And Brownsville owes its existence to the successful campaign of Colonel Byrd and their persistence and skill, which was displayed so well in 1759. So ladies and gentlemen, it's actually going to conclude the presentation. At this point, I'll open it up to any questions, if you have any. I'm going to turn the lights on here.